Sergio Perez has shut down all of the critics after Red Bull decided to continue with the collaboration until at least the end of this season, despite his contract being valid until the end of 2026. Amid all of the speculation and tests that Lawson and Ricciardo would receive in Imola, it seems like the Austrian team is keen on keeping the current pair of drivers together, which is putting their Constructors' Championship under direct threat from not only McLaren, but also teams like Ferrari and Mercedes, with the RB20 not being the fastest car on the grid in the last 8 stints. Could this turn out to be a pivotal mistake when it comes to the Constructors' Championship? And what does it mean for the young talents in Red Bull, such as Tsunoda and Lawson? It goes without saying that Sergio Perez is one of the most controversial figures in the sport right now, because despite having such a competitive car in his hands, the slump in his performance ever since he received the contract renewal has been, well, pretty abysmal. In the last 8 rounds, Perez managed to score only 28 points, which compared to his teammate Verstappen, who scored 141, is a pretty huge gap. To put things in perspective, Perez scored 3.5 points per race during his stretch, while Verstappen has 5 times the amount, around 17.6. This would help Verstappen in his quest to win the 4th championship of his career, but it is definitely putting a big dent in Red Bull's chances of winning the Constructors' Championship by a large margin. Furthermore, he has been outqualified by Sargent 8 times this season in a span of 14 races. That's being outqualified once every 2nd racing weekend. And to put things into perspective, Perez is now closer to Behrman in the Drivers' Championship, who drove 1 race for Ferrari and scored 6 points, than he is to Verstappen. The Mexican has 122 points more than Behrman, but 147 points less than the 3-time world champion, not to mention how much more he would have capitalised on races like Austria, where Verstappen had a collision, drove a full lap with a punctured tyre, served a full pit stop, served a 10-second penalty, and still finished 2 places ahead of his teammate, who failed to defend against the Haas of Hulkenberg. As of now, the gap between Red Bull and McLaren sits at 42 points, as the Woking-based squad managed to shed an additional 9 points from the Austrian squad despite having a poor race with Norris. The difference is that they have 2 competitive drivers up ahead that are very close to each other, with Piastri being the 2nd highest scoring driver in this 8-race stretch with 126 points to his name, while Norris has 10 points less. Regardless, the threat is real, and had it not been for the DSQ of Russell, Mercedes would have been 18 points closer too, flirting with the 100-point margin that could easily go down in the last 10 races, as the W15 has also proven to be a very competitive car. Elaborating on the future of Perez, Horner went on to say, "Checo remains a Red Bull racing driver despite all the speculations of late. We look forward to seeing him perform at circuits where he has also previously done well after the summer break." What seems quite confusing to understand is why Red Bull has even started talks about potential replacements for Perez, when they ultimately decided, with a brief talk, that he would continue to be the driver next to Verstappen for the remainder of the season. With the latest news that Ricciardo will be remaining at Racing Bulls, it's now evident that Lawson should be looking for a seat elsewhere, because there are no more seats available in the Red Bull nest. Even in Spa, the team had the perfect alibi to get rid of Perez, because he started at P2, lost a position immediately at the start, and then went on to finish the race 8th with the fastest lap, which has been promoted to 7th after Russell's unfortunate DSQ. This is the only reason why he is still 7th in the championship and not 8th, as it would have been the Mercedes driver who would have jumped ahead of him, putting one of the 2 clauses that Red Bull had in the contract with Perez at an ever more valid point. But despite many critics believing that Perez has held up Verstappen in the race and ultimately made him fight his own teammate rather than letting him pass in that 2nd stint, the 3-time world champion doesn't share the opinion with the media, as he went on to say, "No, Perez didn't hold me up. He was driving his own race. We made the right choice in that, and it wouldn't have made much difference to me if he had pulled over earlier. Our first concern is the car. That is where we have to focus at the moment. Checo's weekend was positive, in my opinion. For context, reports have emerged that Red Bull has inserted 2 clauses in Perez's contract, and the first one was that he wouldn't be 100 points below Verstappen in the Drivers' Championship, while the other one was that he wouldn't be lower than P6. Despite these 2 massively going in favour of Red Bull's fears, they still decided that Perez is the driver to continue with, even though he received a lot of criticism from Helmut Marko, who said that the Mexican driver totally collapsed during the Spa GP, and it wasn't something that they expected out of his race. This is where the cruel reality of the sport comes in. Money. Perez brings a lot of revenue for Red Bull from merchandise sales as well as sponsorship dividends, which are likely more than enough to mitigate the loss that the team would receive if they were to lose the Constructors' Championship to McLaren, which is now seeming like the end game scenario of 2024. But despite McLaren, Mercedes is also on the rise, having 2 drivers constantly fighting for podiums and race wins, and with Verstappen finishing the previous 2 races at P5 and not scoring podiums on each one of them. With this feature last time happening back in 2019, it's safe to assume that Red Bull are not in a perfect position right now. What this also goes to show is that they would much rather value the financial stability than the growth of their young drivers, such as Tsunoda and Lawson. Earlier this year, Marko said that if Red Bull are unable to find a seat for Lawson from 2025 onwards, he has a clause in his contract that allows him to go somewhere else, and as of now, Audi's interest seems to be really high for the young Kiwi driver. They already signed a veteran in Hulkenberg. Now all they need is a young gun who would prove to be the moving force of the team, and he is willing to show that Red Bull has lost a lot by not investing in him. And this would make a lot of sense for Lawson too, because now that he isn't replacing Ricciardo in the Racing Bull's seat, we must also remember that Marko stated the wishes of the team's stakeholders. This is a team that must consist of 2 young drivers, and Lawson needs to be there as soon as possible. Unfortunately for Marko, the last 2 critics he's sent towards Ricciardo and Perez didn't seem to work, and they've now gone in the way of Horner, who now seemingly has more and more power within the team, even when it comes to the decision of who drives where. This is definitely going to haunt Red Bull in the future if the car doesn't seem to work wonders for the remainder of the 2024 season as well as 2025, because the team hasn't won a race in the last 4 venues, and the last time that they hadn't won a race more than 2 consecutive events was 2022, Austria and Silverstone, while in 2021 they failed to win a race on 3 occasions in a row: Brazil, Qatar and Saudi Arabia. This goes to show that the dominance of the Austrian team is probably finally over, and they're putting all of their hopes in the hands of Verstappen to win the Drivers' Championship, as the Dutchman is now entering the summer break with a comfortable 78-point lead over Norris. The Austrian squad should also be grateful that the McLaren team hasn't been quite as sharp with their strategy, as it could easily have been that Norris would have only had a 30 to 40 point deficit to Verstappen. But this is where champions are made, and this is where championship mentality matters the most. However, it's an individualistic achievement, and as a team, Red Bull seem to have failed to look for what is best for the team, and rather what is best for their lead driver, because a couple of months ago, Verstappen and his father Jos were pushing hard towards signing Perez on a multi-year contract, which makes a lot of sense because the 3-time world champion had a solid lead to his teammate, and he wasn't any threat like he posed to be in the early stages of 2022 and 2023. Be that as it may, Red Bull is now showing their true faces, and when the masks are down, the reality is harsh for drivers like Tsunoda and Lawson. Despite both of them saying that they feel ready for the next big step, the team has definitely let them down, and continuing the work with a driver who is underperforming heavily is not the mentality that we'd expect to see, but here we are. Perez has 10 races to prove that the faith invested in him by Horner and also Verstappen is going to pay off, but starting P2 in Spa, definitely the best track for Red Bull, and finishing P8 is definitely not a good sign for the next races to come. With all this in mind, do you think that Red Bull has done the right thing to continue the collaboration with Perez? And more importantly, if not, who do you think would be the best replacement for the 6-time race winner? Let us know what you think down in the comments below, and once you've done that, have a look at the video that's appearing on your screen right now.